Ladies and gentlemen, just while the final people take their seats this evening, I would just like to begin by saying thank you very much for coming along to the Nicholson Museum this evening, particularly on such an unpleasant evening in terms of the weather. Before I introduce our speaker tonight and explain what we're going to be doing, I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the fact that the University of Sydney is built on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and the university and the museum pays respect to the traditional owners. It's a great pleasure to be involved in tonight's presentation, tonight's talk, for a number of reasons. One, that I, like a lot of people in this room, is a former student of Judy Birmingham and very much an admirer of Judy's work. But the other thing is to say that we are about to enter into a period of very profound change at the museums as we head into the opening of the Chow Chak Wing Museum in 2019. One of the things that we intend to do with this series of talks that we'll run throughout this year and next year, called A Life in Archaeology, is to actually pay respect and acknowledge some of the pioneering figures in the history of the academic discipline of archaeology and associated subjects like history, and some of the pioneering figures in the history of the museum as well. So it's a double special privilege to introduce Judy to you this evening. I don't really need to introduce Judy because that's the whole point of the evening. We're going to go on a trip through memory lane and talk about Judy's life in archaeology. I would like to invite you at the end of the evening, if this is okay with Judy, if any of you have memories or would like to have a question for Judy, you're most welcome to come and talk to her later on when we have a glass of wine at the end of it as well too. So open for everybody. But first up, Judy Birmingham. Thank you very much for joining us. So this is a photograph we took this morning because you and I have had a fantastic morning working out what we were going to talk about and prodding you for memories and all sorts of things. So I guess we should start at the very beginning, your childhood. So what can you tell us about your childhood memories?
Well, it was, of course, in England, and it was largely during the war. So my memories are a lot of warfare, searchlights, aeroplanes shooting each other on their way to London, of course, because we lived just on the route from Harwich to London. And the sort of bad habits that I kept from that time was that you never throw food away, but you never throw anything else away either. And so I'm afraid I have rather a hoarding sort of problem.
I think that goes for being an archaeologist though, doesn't it? So.
Yeah. But the other point was that my pursuits were all over the fields, up the trees and out the back. I was what in those days used to be called a tomboy, and I was very interested reading about Kathleen Kenyon to find that she called herself a tomboy too. But you know, catapults, acorns and tree climbing, tree houses, all those things. And I was, as I say, very intrigued to see that her background was very similar to mine. I only had two brothers, no sisters, of course. And my mother once, I remember, said to me, you know, because we all had hand-me-down clothes, all from my brothers, and my mother said, oh, how I'd like to buy you a nice frilly dress. And I said to her, but what would I do with it? And that sort of was the background, I have to say.
Was there any interest in archaeology and history at that early stage, or did that develop later?
Not archaeology as such, but I always liked working out problems and finding things and looking for answers and all those things. I think that was the connection but no archaeology during the war, and not till later.
We were talking this morning about your awareness of, well, we're talking about Gertrude Bell in particular, but some of those pioneering female figures of exploration and discovery as well. I mean, you were obviously conscious of some of those people at that stage, but was it ever something you wanted to emulate, or?
Oh, absolutely. I wanted to be an explorer, like all those Gertrude Bells and Freya Stark and all those people. And of course, some of them were archaeological as well, like Dorothy Garrett, who excavated Mount Carmel. And I really did want that sort of active life. I was, in fact, born on a Thursday, as it happened. And so I always remembered that Thursday's child had far to go. And I rather suspect that that's what happened.
Now, jumping forward in time a little bit, you studied initially at St Andrews. Any memories from that time?
Well, yes. For some reason, I did classics up there, because I'd been quite good at Latin at school. And we had a marvellous old professor called Herbert Jennings Rhodes, who was a specialist on Greek mythology and religion and things like that. So I do remember him. He was a real character and very good at crosswords too. And of course my friends up there were very lively. It was the time of demobbed students, all the blokes up there were recently demobbed from the army. So it was very much livelier than later, I think. And yes, we had a little group of friends, and I remember that among them was a good friend called Fay Birkinshaw.
This is an image of her more famous name.
Her more famous name, of course, Fay Wheldon. And she came out here, about 10 years ago, but she was a very close friend, and now, of course, a very famous writer. But lots of them were very talented people.
Now, you were telling me this morning that Fay also has a connection with your a period of 2 years in your life between St Andrews and the Institute of Archaeology in London.
That's right, yeah.
I believe you were a spy.
Well, I wasn't quite a spy. Fay was, at that stage, a copywriter, I think, in advertising in London. And she had then moved into a job in the Foreign Office. And then she had to leave it for some reason. I think she went off to write and so on. And so she recommended me for the job. And it turned out to be a most fascinating job in something called Information Research Department, IRD, in the Foreign Office. And it was very much connected with the Cold War. And what we did was to process information. I mean, it was highly secret, although we didn't really get intelligence. We got things like newspaper reports and things and processed them for handing out to other people. We weren't quite Bletchley Park, but we were, like the garage to Bletchley Park, I suppose. Yeah, but that was absolutely fascinating, and I'd never lost since then my interest in spy literature and all those sort of things. It was fascinating.
Well, I guess at those early phases in the Cold War too, there was a real feeling of the pressure to know what the Soviets were up to and what was happening. And
oh yes, yeah.
So then, coming back to an interest in classics and ultimately archaeology, the next phase is your period of study at the Institute of Archaeology in London. Yeah. Now, I should point out that Judy's eyesight's not what it used to be, so I'm going to explain for her benefit what the slides are, but if anyone can't read the label, hopefully for your benefit as well. This is an image of the Institute of Archaeology's building in Gordon Square in London, but of course when you were studying at the Institute, they weren't actually yet located completely in this venue, were they?
Most of it was here, but the Institute actually had been founded well before the war, with the first director, I think, was Gordon Child, wasn't he?
I think it was Mortimer Wheeler.
Oh, Mortimer Wheeler first, that's right. And it was founded in Regent's Park, in a wonderful old Regency building, which had one or two failings, in that if it rained, we all had to get buckets to put underneath the drips.
Sounds like the Nicholson Museum, I should say.
Yeah, but it was an amazing place, and I mean, Sir Mortimer Wheeler occasionally dropped in, but he had moved on to India before the war, and then I think Kathleen Kenyon was the acting director during the war.
Now might be a nice time to bring up the next image, which is the photograph of the staff members of the Institute in 1955 and 1956. And because you were studying there at the time, that you happened to overlap with some of the most prominent figures in the history of archaeology in Britain in the mid-20th century. What I'm going to get you to do in a moment's time is just a few character sketches of some of these prominent figures. But, you know, in this image, we were talking about it earlier, that, you know, we see Child, we see Max Mallowan, we see Kathleen Kenyon, we see Joan de Platte-Taylor. What was it like actually being in there at the time? Was there a buzz at the time, or was it just sort of a relatively benign institution?
Well, it would be lovely to say that it was full of these sort of eccentric characters and that they were all living up to their reputation of being eccentric. But in fact, they were all pretty silent. Kathleen Kenyon was busy writing up Jericho. She'd excavated Jericho in the early 50s, and was busy writing that up, so that Kathleen Kenyon was a silent figure, accompanied by her dogs always. On the whole, the dogs are more important than she was. And Gordon Child, ooh, the back fell off.
You okay?
That's all right. I don't need it. I won't lean back. Remind me.
Don't lean back. There's Child in the centre.
Yeah, now Gordon Child blew in and out then, but he was getting on a lot then, and he wasn't yes, he was the director still, and very eccentric. There's no doubt about that. He was a very eccentric gentleman and very silent. He did apparently take his students out for, that's better, he did take his students out for lunch sometimes, but he didn't talk to other people, and normally wore sort of very eccentric clothing and so on, and drove, I think, we think a Model T car, Ford. He liked cars, that was one thing he did like, and yeah.
Well, I think let's bring up some images of some of these people, and we can talk about your memories of some of these particular people. And I'm going to begin with Max Mallowan, who actually was your supervisor at the time.
Yes, he was.
But I find rather interesting because, of course, you were working on Cyprus, on Iron Age Cyprus at this point in time. Whereas this was the height of his period of working in Nimrod. At any stage did he try to get you to Iraq to actually join his excavations, or was there something of a different, distance in terms of that supervisor role?
He was not interested in getting his students to Nimrud, as far as I know. He was a lot older than that when I knew him. And my real supervisor was Joan du Platte-Taylor, who was working in Cyprus. I don't know that Max knew a lot about Cyprus, to be honest, but being a male, he was the supervisor, and that was the story.
Because there were a number of women working in Cyprus at the time. There was Joan, but there was also Veronica Seton-Williams and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, were you working closely with
Oh,
that generation?
yes, I did work with all those. Veronica actually worked more, she was Australian, and she worked more in Syria at that time. I'm not sure, I wonder who was digging at Achana at that stage. Nicholas might know. No, the supervision of Cyprus was strictly limited to Joan du Plat-Taylor, who had excavated there, and yeah.
What was Mallowan like as a person? I've always heard he was rather aloof, but is that the case?
Max?
Yeah.
Oh, no, Max was very jolly. My view about Max actually was that he was the original for Agatha. That's Agatha Christie on the other side, of course. He was married to her. She was older than he was. My feeling was that he was the original for Hercule Poirot. But of course, once Hercule Poirot got on the television, it wasn't it wasn't viable any longer, because he wasn't a bit like that. But I do think that that's where the idea came from.
Did you meet Agatha?
Oh, yes, but she too was aloof and silent. In fact, Max had a system where he took his students out once a term to lunch at the Athenaeum. Now, many of you, of course, will know perfectly well that the Athenaeum was one of the top establishment clubs in Piccadilly, and very, very elite. So we all trooped down there, and he and Agatha sat at one head of the table, and he was at the other. And the fact was that she scarcely spoke, that I remember. She just gazed at everyone with this rather sinister look. And she was not chatty at all. But it was, I think, a rather strange custom that they would take us as students to the Athenaeum. I mean, nobody else that I've ever known went to the Athenaeum for lunch.
You may have inspired a character as you were watching the students as well. So.
Possibly.
Now, well, very quickly, I was just, while we're talking about Max, of course, is to point out that many of these figures have connections with the Nicholson Museum for a whole range of different reasons. But of course, Max was working at the time at Nimrod, and these are just two of a number of the Assyrian ivories that have ended up in Australia. So again, it's rather interesting to have the objects associated with the excavations here and visible behind you.
Well, and that's even more relevant to my appointment, of course, because presumably in order to arrange the transaction about the Nimrod ivories, Max was in touch with Jim Stewart, who was back around at that point. And so at some point, he asked James Stewart if he had any specialists. No, James asked Max, of course, whether Max had any students who were interested in Cyprus, because of course James was only interested in Cyprus. And since James Stewart was a Bronze Age specialist, he wanted someone to do the Iron Age. And as that was the topic of my thesis, and Max was the supervisor, Max immediately said, "Oh, well, we do have someone here who might be interested," and that was how it all began.
The next slide I'm going to put up is another one of those prominent figures, Sir Mortimer Wheeler. Any memories of Wheeler? You mentioned before that he was largely in India, in the subcontinent at the time.
Yes, he'd gone off to be director of antiquities there immediately after the war, I think, if not before, after, I think. Well, he had a reputation, shall we say. And
I have no idea what you mean, Judy. Tell us more.
Well, no, people... But I think people didn't really do photography and go into the dark room with Sir Mortimer. But I mean, the whole point about Sir Mortimer Wheeler was far more important than that. He had developed this really rigid and orderly system of excavation. And his belief was that the archaeological record had to be of total integrity, so that excavation had to be done very meticulously, stratigraphically, and measured and planned and all the rest of it. And so mainly, of course, he was working on Roman sites in Britain, and it was totally applicable to them. And he was followed, I think, by one of his students who was called Sam Shepherd Freer, who was much younger, and who also ran excavations, particularly at St Albans, Verulamium, which...
we have a picture in a moment's time, actually.
Yeah, Max had made... Sir Mortimer had made his own. What have I done? No. So there was this tradition, and in the middle of it, of course, was Kenyon, Kathleen Kenyon, who also was part of this whole system of meticulous stratigraphic excavation. So that that tradition was very much part of the Institute and the Institute for Philosophy.
Now, the next image we have is the Australian connection with the Institute, which of course is Vere Gordon-Child, who was the director of the Institute while you were there. You were telling me yesterday, you mentioned before about his love of cars, but you had a fantastic story about Child parking. Could you repeat that anecdote?
Well, I didn't actually see it. It was one of those apocryphal stories about Gordon Child that at one point, I think in Regent's Park, he got himself boxed in his car. His car was parked. He couldn't get it out. The cars in front and behind were too close. And it was reported that he got in the car and simply shunted backwards and forwards, moving each car in the other direction until he had cleared enough space to get out. And I can believe it, but I'm not going to say it was true.
What was he like as a person?
Well, to me, and in the late stage, I never saw him in the new institute, but in Regent's Park he was pretty silent, but very eccentric, there's no doubt about that. His clothing was rather subjective, we may say.
Yes. You mentioned earlier the photograph behind me of him is very much how you remember him, slightly unkempt.
Yes, very much as I remember him. Of course, we didn't realise then that he was Australian, not until much later. And people, I mean, one of the things, Craig, is that people at the Institute didn't chat as you chat nowadays with students and staff and so on. It was a fairly silent place, and I think sort of protocol rather operated. I only remember really chatting with people like Joan de Platt Taylor and Veronica Seton Williams, who were in the library, because she was the librarian. And that was a slightly different setting, but I don't remember lectures and things like that. So it wasn't very chatty. Only Max was very friendly and sociable.
Now the last person will have a quick character sketch off before talking about some of your early excavation and coming to Australia, is in Turkey, and it's James Mallard, who is in this particular photograph in the centre smoking the cigarette. You met James in the mid-1950s when you first went to Turkey.
Yeah, I knew him quite well, actually. We were students together in a sense, but he had already moved up to being deputy director at Ankara under Seton Lloyd. And I do remember visiting the site of Hagilar when he was excavating there. I only remember him as a very pleasant and, friendly person, but obviously there was an awful lot more going on, as there had to be if you were digging in Turkey. It wasn't that easy with the authorities. And, there were many stories about Melart, which people have heard.
And the Dorak treasure affair and all sorts of other things that were to follow later on in his career.
Yeah,
as well.
That's right. Later, yeah.
Now,
but of course, and then the great Çatalhöyük excavation, which was to be really formative in his career.
Now, I'm going to take you back in time a little bit to the very first excavation you worked on. And I must admit, this is also from a personal interest as well, because we're going to go to Cyprus and Paphos. But your very first fieldwork excavation was with Terence Mitford and the St Andrews excavations at Kuklia, or Palaepaphos, the ancient sanctuary site to Aphrodite. What do you remember about the experience and Cyprus at that point in time?
Well, the first thing is that it was my first contact with archaeology. I'd been quite interested in ancient history, and I was quite good at it. And so, as I came up high in the class list, Bruce Mitford, who was another of these ex-war sort of heroes, but like everyone else, pretty silent about it. And Bruce Mitford said I should go invited me on the team that he was taking to Paphos. And we excavated there. The first excavation was a Bronze Age tomb, and that I remember very clearly, excavating the dromos and going down and then actually moving. I went into the chamber, and I do remember that very clearly. It was dramatic. But then we also worked on this area too. And it was just a standard sort of Cypriot excavation with the workmen doing all the work and us just sort of supervising and directing and all having, in fact, a lot of fun.
As you do in Paphos. Then you also did some field work in Britain as well. And we were talking earlier this morning about how this particular experience working at Wybalennium really drove home to you the importance of proper excavation technique and that real focus on the following the integrity of the evidence. Can you take us through any memories from working in Britain?
Well, Wybalennium is the one site I remember with Sam Freer. And it was, being a Roman site, and it had a lot of students on it, it was fairly crowded and very open. It was an open town excavation. And I worked partly on the site and partly in the potshed, I remember, which was a place I was always to end up in most excavations, for some reason. And it was a very pleasant experience. Sam Freer was like a human being, actually, compared to some of the other characters at the Institute. Much younger, I think that may have been part of it, yeah.
All right, now you've already spoken about Max's connection with James Stewart here at the University of Sydney, but let's jump to 1961 now, and the SS Himalaya, which was the boat you came out to Australia on.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about, that when you first got the offer to take up a teaching position at the University of Sydney, how you responded, and then about the actual journey across, because ironically you met James Stewart on the boat.
I did indeed, yes. Well, as I mentioned, James had been in touch with Mallowan, I think by phone, and probably, well, not by phone, of course, not then, but so Max mentioned to me that there was the possibility of going to Sydney. And of course, at that stage, let's talk, we're talking 58, 59, no students went to Australia. They all went to America, or no, not even Canada, actually. No, America, preferably California. But not Australia, you see. And so for 5 or 6 weeks, I didn't mention it to my partner of the time, thinking, well, who would go all that way? And it's a long way from Cyprus and all that sort of stuff. And when I finally did mention it to him, he was a copywriter in London with, who was that guy, the writer?
Bryce Courtney.
Bryce Courtney, that's right. He was working with Bryce Courtney in London for just as a footnote. And he said, oh, well, it's funny you should say that, because Sydney is the one place overseas that I could probably get work. And so that's how it all started, because he was quite a difficult person. And if he was going to be happy about it, well, that was a good start. So we booked and did all the right things and got on board the Himalaya, which was a most wonderful ship, I must say. People must know it from here. Is it still going?
No, it was decommissioned in the early 70s, but quite a large number of the artefacts in this room came out on that boat.
Is that so?
Yes.
Gosh. Well, anyway, on the way we stopped in Ceylon. You may know it better as Sri Lanka. And went up to Kandy and did all the right things and so on. But that was only a day trip. Then we went on. And when we got to, other way around, isn't it? Port Said, we got there in the evening, and there were lots of lights around, and as I wrote at the time, all the gully men in their little boats selling things and all that sort of thing. And then we saw in the distance this strange procession lit up of a stretcher being carried by 4 men and followed by ladies and so on, brought on board. And that was the arrival of James Rivers Barrington Stewart. And he was brought on board very sick, and of course when we got back to Sydney he didn't really recover. He recovered a bit, but he was to die unfortunately the following year. And the reason being that he had been a prisoner of war and had been very badly treated, and so was suffering this illness. I never knew what it was, by the way, but he was just ill. But he was not quite so ill that he couldn't always have the colonial sundowner, the G&T, up at Mount Pleasant. We always had drinks at sundown, so he couldn't have been that sick, I think.
And for those in the room who don't know, Mount Pleasant was his property up near Bathurst, but when we say property, it was a Scottish baronial mansion, wasn't it?
Well, it was discovered by his father, who'd been an explorer, and discovered Mount Stewart, which was just next door. It was certainly a mansion, and it was certainly baronial, but it was also rather aged and decrepit. And I do remember hearing the sound of the rain coming through in the ballroom there, and remembering Regent's Park, because we all had to run for buckets again, you see. So this one enduring theme that followed me round the world was that of leaking roofs and rain coming in. Interesting.
Now, of course, he'd been quite a controversial figure here at the University of Sydney because he was trying to actually move to the Department of Archaeology from the main campus up to Mount Pleasant
That's
at the
right.
time, and it had terrible struggles with the University Senate. Did you spend, you obviously went up there, but did you spend much time in Bathurst when you first arrived?
Yeah, he wanted us to stay there. My partner immediately reacted to this and would not go there, but in fact was taken there by force at times, but felt, as was reasonable, that the University of Sydney was here. And if I was appointed to it, that's where I should be. However, we did spend time up there, and I certainly spent a lot of time up there. And I suspect that Stuart couldn't really travel that much, but he did keep students up there in this aged sort of baronial place. And I mean, I think it's been, a biography's been written about it.
Yes, about he and
yes,
Eve, his second wife.
But
yes.
It was an unbelievable situation to come out to from England, where I was just a simple student in London, to come to this great creaky old house, which when it was winter, he had a couple of old retainers who he referred to as serfs and villeins, who used to bring in the firewood. And of course, Eve Stuart, his second wife, had all the turkeys outside, which were used as gifts to the staff of Sydney University, as a result of which, of course, Stuart got very favoured treatment. And I think that was the purpose. Plus, there were 38 cats, because I counted them once, and they all had to be fed, and then all the dishes had to be washed up every night after we had washed up all our dishes. So the evening session did go on a bit. Now there was one other thing I wanted to mention about. Oh, it'll come back.
Sorry. Well, I was just going to say that, I mean, everyone talks about the cats, but you're the first person I've met to actually know how many there were, which is probably more than Jim and Eve did, actually.
Oh, he did. They all had names, and he knew every single
Yes.
one, no question.
And as I said, they were all acknowledged in his chapter, the publication of the Swedish Cyprus expedition. In the acknowledgements, before any human gets acknowledged, all of the 38 cats are named as well. So.
I should mention that the atmosphere at the Mount was sometimes a little bit strained, because Eve Stuart, who was his second wife, as I say, had been his draftsperson and had been employed at Sydney. But because if you got married, you had to resign, she had to resign that job, and of course continued to do drawing for Jim, but she was very, very annoyed.
As she should be. Now, that's perhaps a good time for us to talk about the university and perhaps touch upon university politics a little bit. I've got these fantastic photographs of Sydney University in the early 1960s. There might be a few people in the room who remember, in an era when you were allowed to sit on the roof of Fisher Library and, Parramatta
That's
Road
right.
before the footbridge.
Yeah, I remember that.
So it's a long time ago now. But what were your first thoughts of the University of Sydney, to actually come all the way around the world to see a mini Oxbridge? What were your impressions and thoughts?
I don't. There were so many things going on, Craig, that I didn't have a lot of time for. I suppose I just took it as it was, and I did enjoy the students enormously from the very beginning, And of course I also came to the museum at that point, and that was a major point. But there was so much going on. I'd come out with my colleague Vincent McGaw, who was interested in European material, and I think Dick Breen came a little bit later. I'm not sure. And there was just so much happening. I went on a couple of Australian excavations with Richard Wright, and I just seem to remember that there was so much happening. And of course we had the sickness of Jim Stewart, and then his eventual death, getting to know the lecture schedule, which I needed to check up on, and all the rest of it. Yeah, it's a fairly mixed period for me, I must say.
I mean, it's worthwhile pointing out that whilst it was a period for the Department of Archaeology, and indeed the university more broadly, to expand, that you were the only female staff member within the Department of Archaeology, and indeed one of the few female staff members teaching within the Faculty of Arts at the time. Did you regard yourself as a feminist pioneer?
That question always makes me smile. I was so used to domineering women in archaeology, and then when we got out here, the whole of Stewart's sort of menage was run by two women. It never occurred to me for a moment that I was not extremely powerful. I think I never thought about that aspect. I was never a feminist, certainly not in those days. And as archaeology and women had always gone together. And I suppose I would have thought, if anything, it was odd to have so many men around.
Actually, I'll come back to this one just while we're talking about it. I mean, I suspect that if Stuart hadn't have passed away so young, that you probably would have had a relatively standard career lecturing in Near Eastern archaeology, potentially working on one of his excavations, or perhaps your own excavation in Cyprus or somewhere else in the Middle East. But because he passed away, did you suddenly find yourself needing to find other opportunities and other research questions because field work wasn't an option from an Australian perspective at that point in time in the 1960s?
No, I don't think that. Certainly I was not in any sense experienced at raising funds or doing the sorts of things that you had to do if you were out here then to dig overseas. I knew nothing about getting rich people to pay up to send me away somewhere. And so that was out of the question as far as I was concerned. I'd have been brought up on state education in England. I never had to pay for anything, and it never occurred to me for a moment that you would have to raise funds for these things, because there were no heritage grants in those days. Sorry, what was the next bit?
Well, just without those opportunities.
Oh, that's right, yes. So did I look elsewhere? No, I wasn't looking elsewhere. I still I travelled all through the early 60s. I was still very much engaged in Near Eastern archaeology. But then a few things happened. One of them was the Vietnam War, and the students became very active indeed. Well, everyone knows that. We also had the Beatles tour, of course. But it was a very lively time, and students didn't just sit down and do what they were told, and they wanted to excavate. There was a very powerful archaeological society, the president being David Frankel, or should I say Emeritus Professor David Frankel, who went to Melbourne. And he was the president, and he had some very able assistant students, and they all wanted to excavate. Now, for Stuart, it hadn't been a big problem, because he didn't run a big excavation, and he always had one or two students who he could take over to Cyprus. I don't know, I presume they paid their own way.
That's my understanding, yes.
Sorry?
That was my understanding at the time.
It was, right. They paid their own way. And he was adamant that we should not excavate in Australia. Absolutely adamant. And he had forbidden Basil Hennessy to do that. And I think virtually the whole of the academic board, the professorial board, was in agreement. But the students were determined. And because it was a period of protest, they made a big fuss. And at the same time, I'd been in touch with a few, I don't know why I had, but I'd heard from Kevin Fay and from Stanley Lipscomb about this pottery site up near Raymond Terrace, which had been the pottery site of a James King colonist who had had a very profitable, apparently, operation there. And they had gone up and looked at it and said, wouldn't it be interesting to dig it up? And so did our students. And so eventually, 1967, we did have a very small expedition and David Frankel was operational in this, of course, being the president, and Christie and a few others, and we went up to Irrawang, which was the name of his pottery, and began excavations. And it was already part of the Hunter District Water Board, and who were very supportive and helped us a lot. And occasionally we got dumps of their building material to build a dig house up there, and their ranger was very helpful, and so on. So the thing grew, vacation by vacation. That was all. That's how it started.
Well, before you tell us more about the birth of Australian historical archaeology in this context, I just want to quickly show two slides, in many ways representing your last fieldwork in the Mediterranean region, and this is working with Alexander Cambidoglu's team at Zagara. Before we have a quick image of the site, I do want to show you this particular photograph from the Australian Women's Weekly of July 1968, where Judy was one of the I don't know, the page 3 girl potentially, but you are photographed within the lab of the Nicholson Museum, and this particular photograph is also with Dick Harding on the very far right, and it's Frank Dungry, isn't it?
Fred.
Yeah.
Fred Dungry.
Fred, sorry.
Yes. Oh, that's me in the corner.
That's you in the corner.
Yeah, right. Yes. So we made the Women's Weekly.
You made the Women's Weekly, which is, there's nothing more Australian than that.
In fact, the press was very interested in what was going on. There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
The site itself on Andros, and of course it's been revived in the last couple of years with Leslie Birmingham is here and Meg Miller. But any memories of working with the very first Australian project in Greece?
Well, of course, 67 was the year we started at Irrawang as well.
Yeah.
So
it was a busy year for you.
Yeah. Oh, they all were. 67 and 69 I went, yes. Well, yes, I do remember Zagara very fondly. It was a wonderful place. And the workmen were terrific. Our colleagues were fantastic there. Yes, it was a very enjoyable excavation, I must say. And in fact, I'm going to talk to the people while I'm down here about going over my notes from then to see how they integrate with what's happened since.
There's two very quick things I'll ask you to recount. One is the story of Professor Cambidoglu and his notes on the cliff face.
Well, I was walking up over the hill at one point, deciding I would go and look at the Mediterranean and have a bit of a break. And then I observed a figure standing there, silhouetted on the edge of the cliff, and blowing away in the wind were the pages of his dig notes. Because, as you know, Zagorou is a very windy site. You could hardly hold on to anything. But I must say, I was very struck by this vision of this fantastic record of this major excavation just blowing over the horizon. And I can't forget it, I know.
The other thing I just want to touch upon, of course, as an adjunct to your involvement in the project, that you continued your interest in the ethnographic record, particularly of local ceramic traditions, both on Andros itself, but elsewhere in Greece and elsewhere in Turkey, which culminated in some ways, not just with a series of publications, but you also had an exhibition in the Macleay Museum of some of that material that you had collected during your travels during these times.
Yeah. That's right.
Why were you interested?
Yeah. Well, my interest was that seeing these local village potters making pots for households was really the closest thing one could get. This was in pre-industrial Andros. Was the closest thing you could do to getting to a village situation where craftsmen were making artifacts for use in households. It was as simple as that, but I couldn't resist the whole concept of seeing this actually a living tradition, and including the import and export to some extent of what had gone on there for centuries before. So I worked in Andros, and then I went on and did work in Turkey. I'm not sure about other Greek sites. Can you remember any? I can't, no. But Andros was certainly the main one. And now I hear from you, Craig, that this tradition has almost come to an end.
Yes, I think Leslie would know more than I, but I believe that many of the potters that you went and saw, I mean, their workshops have now closed. So
amazing.
Century-long traditions that have died out.
Once again, ethnography was very helpful.
And the timing that you were actually
was amazing.
Almost anthropologically recording was absolutely timely. Mm. So talking about local, I'll come to it in a moment, but I was going to try and segue into Irrawang at that point in time, but two very nice photographs from the University Archives very quickly. This is from 1983, and it's the launch of the book Industrial Archaeology in Australia. It's a photograph of you with Ian Jack, who's in the room somewhere, and with Dennis as well. A little bit later on in the process, but by this stage, by the 80s, historical archaeology has been birthed and is growing as a field. I mean, just how active were you at this point in time? Besides Barry, obviously, but...
Well, considering that I was lecturing full-time in Near Eastern through until 1990, and running HA, which started only as an undergraduate single-year course, but rapidly developed with every year up to MA and PhD, I was fairly occupied. And I did apparently get some publications done, which was... I saw in my CV, to my amazement.
In terms of getting that course off the ground, I mean, I believe you met quite a fair bit of resistance within the university at the time to actually get a historical archaeology formal course.
Oh, very much so.
Any memories?
I have to thank my colleague up there, Ian Jack, who's here, who happened to be dean at the time, and so was able to think of this strategy of interdepartmental courses. And so historical archaeology was brought in 73 as an interdepartmental course, including historian, geographer. Dennis Jeans was a human geographer. And of course, we also did soil science, which was not anything that archaeology had thought relevant before. So that's when it started, really. And I mean, we'd all been, I think we were all from Britain, and we had all been involved in the research for these industrial sites. And I had also been very much connected with the National Trust at that point, with Peter James, who had set up the Industrial Archaeology Committee. And so we started classifying old industrial sites. And I'm awfully afraid that I may have contributed to, you know, the departure of my colleague Peter James from the Trust, in that some of the older members of the Trust did not see aged industrial buildings as the proper concern of the National Trust of Australia. And so that was rather sad. But at the same time, the Industrial Archaeology Committee was very busy, did lots of things, and classified a lot of buildings.
I'm going to take you back to Irrawang again, and you know, talking about local pottery traditions. But we've got a couple of images that you've brought in that we can have a look at of, you know, that first generation of Australian students actually working on an Australian project. And I especially wanted to put this one up to anyone in the audience working in Australian archaeology who's been wearing hard hats and high-vis vests in the last week, just to show you that the 1960s was a different millennium.
Yes.
What's going on here, Judy?
I have no idea. Yeah, that's certainly Jenny Van Proctor sitting there, who's one of our bright students. I don't know who this one was. Maybe they're just having a chat. But certainly that was standard apparel for excavation. Yeah.
Things have changed, haven't they? And then, you know, just one of the...
Do you want to go back to that?
I should go back to that.
Yes, just for a moment, because one of the interesting things about this picture, this engraving by Carmichael of about 18... it was published just before Irrawang closed in 38. I think it was published in 1838. And the thing that strikes you about it is how sort of English it looks, how gentle and quiet and rustic, you know, all those sort of very complacent English things. Now, what the excavation has, and you see the horse works here in the foreground, nice and quiet, in which a horse goes round and mixes the clay. Now, it is quite clear from our work that King was an experimenter of great energy, and that this could be nothing like the place looked. He was, well, now we'll go on to the next one. Yes, now this is just an example that I happen to find quite readily, but for example, behind that big building with the high hill, what happened was that water came streaming down the high hill and hit the back of what was the work shed at that point, and certainly flooded it out. So he puts in this cross drain so that the water will be streamed either side of the shed and go down and away to the bottom. And so you can see there the excavation of it, how he put in that, he dug it, put in the channel, covered it with tiles, and then filled it with the wasters from earlier firings. And it was just one example of the many innovative and very well done. You can see how good his workmanship was.
Now, of course, Irrawang was the subject in 2007 of a Nicholson Museum exhibition, where to mark the 40th anniversary of the excavations beginning, so therefore we're now in the 50th anniversary. But we actually had an exhibition up at the rear of this room as well, which I think was a very exciting project from our perspective at the museum, but also a lovely opportunity to reflect upon what a significant excavation this was.
Well, I was delighted because for the first time since I came here, the whole concept of local Australia was allowed to enter the vital doorway of the Nicholson Museum. And Michael Turner at that time, I spoke mostly to him, but I'm sure everyone was involved, put on this wonderful exhibition of Irrawang, which was in so many ways quite revolutionary. But it was lovely to see the material here and, you know, accepted at last as part of... I mean, we were a department of archaeology. We were not a department of Greek vases. And so, in my view, archaeology covered a lot more than just that.
Now, you've been involved in many different projects and, of course, in a whole range of advocacy and legislative work as well, but I want to touch upon two excavations very, very quickly. I'm conscious that we are about to run out of time. The first one is Wybalenna in Tasmania on Flinders Island. Could you just give us a quick rundown in terms of the work that was done there?
That was a fascinating... That was, in fact, the first excavation that we did, I think. 69 and 71. No, we'd already started at Irrawang by that time. But the reason was that John Morris, director of the National Trust, had a sister living in Flinders Island in Tasmania, here near Wybalenna, and she said the locals are looting this site. And it was the site of a very important place where the Tasmanian Aborigines were taken to reside before they finally went to Oyster Cove. And so we got yes, you can see the houses over in the background there, I think, can you?
Those are the ones you excavated, weren't they? On the left.
Yeah, the ones and so we excavated, I think, 2 cottages mainly, and first had a look at it in 69 and then had a summer school there in 71 and excavated again this sort of contact site of Aboriginal middens outside the front door and what's his name, Robinson, sort of handing out, you know, kitchen food in proper china in the front door. Yeah.
Were you approaching these excavations like you would a Middle Eastern tell, or given there were so many changes within archaeology theory at the time, were you actually wanting to do something new and innovative in terms of field work?
Well, we already had our site at Irrawang, you see, but this was a rescue operation in a sense. Well, I wasn't going to say no to it, was I?
Of course not. The other side I want to touch upon very quickly is Regentville, a little bit closer to home.
Oh, no, that's very different. Wybalenna was an accidental happening, but Regentville was very much a planned operation as part of the by then developing heritage movement and all the national estate grants and so on. Regentville was the home of Sir John Jamieson, and we're very lucky to have here tonight someone who wrote a thesis on Sir John Jamieson and Regentville, 1975, Andrew. And as a result of that, we went there in 75, and Andrew started his thesis, I think, then on. But we went, it was totally ruined, and Jean-Paul Descoudres, who was in our department at the time, as well as me and 1 or 2 other people, a couple of students, including Helen Temple and Kay Francis, all went out there, and Jean-Paul put a single trench right across the site to see what was there. That was 75. No, 85.
I think 75, I think, was the first.
75, it has to be. So at that point, Andrew started a thesis or a project on Sir John Jamieson, and we thought about it, and eventually in 1985 we had applied for a National Estate grant, which we got because by that time there was money to do this sort of thing. And Andrew completed his work on Jamieson, so we knew what we were doing. The background research was there. And we began a proper excavation to look for the methods and the backing, the sort of philosophy that should attend this type of excavation. It was a real project for the heritage movement. So we did, we excavated it, and one of the great finds, we found the whole layout of the house, of course, and one of the great finds was the contents of the privy, where quite clearly all the household servants had tipped down any broken china that they got or broke. And a marvellous collection of imported British ceramics.
Andrew's provided us with 2 photos. I wonder if you can just tell us what's going on in these images from this particular site at Regentville. This one is the photograph with the ladder in it.
Yes, well, the whole point about the excavation when it happened finally was that it was a arrangement between us and New England, and Graham Connor from New England and his students came and joined Sydney University in this excavation. And there are all the students sitting around there, and there, I think, is not that Graham Connor up there? You think it is? Yeah, it is, I think. And there he is, and it's just a sort of sums up the concept of the authoritarian director and and the very humble diggers all around him. It was a fun dig, though, I must say. We had a good agreement with Graham, and it went quite well.
It is a pre-occupation health and safety photo too, though. So. Yes. Now in this one as well, of here you are, but what's going on in this particular image?
As far as I know, the person bending down and digging the hole is Tim Murray, now at La Trobe, still at La Trobe, I think, who was a tutor for HA in those years. It'll be in the 70s or early 80s, I suppose, and he is excavating rather deeper than perhaps he was intended to, and that's me up there in the middle, suggesting that he was really only supposed to be removing the over deposit, yes, the topsoil. So it was a nice picture. I don't know who this one is, can't remember. Who? Ah, right. Well, and what about, are you there, Andrew?
No, that's Tim. That's not digging.
That's Tim with the beard.
Yes.
Tim, yes, of course. I think you'd better explain this. Do you mind? Who the people are?
No, it's only those 3.
Yeah.
And then also from Regentville, this wonderful, wonderful cartoon.
Yes, this person in the foreground is, of course, not Sydney University. That's someone from New England.
with the gin bottle.
Yeah, exactly, yes. And presumably, who's up the ladder, Andrew?
That's me.
Ah! Right, yes. Well, who's here with the theodolite thing? Don't know. Ah. I'm retiring.
Now, we have gone over time, but what I do want to finish up on is a bit of a discussion of your relationship with the Nicholson Museum and with the Macleay Museum collection. So we're going to go back in time a little bit to what this space looked like when you first arrived in Sydney.
Yes.
Before Alexander oversaw the restoration and renovation to that.
Yeah. I did love it the way it was, I must say. I just loved it.
What were some of your relationships with both the museum collections in these early days of your academic career at the university?
Oh, well, I mean, we used this one. Students would come here. We looked at the Jericho material, because you've got the Jericho skull, haven't you?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, and of course the Nimrud ivories from Assyria. And we did come and look at a lot of this material. I was never very skilled in Egyptian material, and I'm sorry about that, because I think you've got a wonderful Egyptian collection. And Vincent, of course, used the European, and in fact contributed quite a lot to the European collection. And he taught there. Yeah, but I mean, you couldn't do all that much with it because it's all under glass and you can only look. I mean, you can't handle.
What about from, I think many of us in the room suffered with the Viva as the student experience. What about from the teaching experience? What was it actually like using the museum collections to intimidate and put the fear of gods in fourth year students for 40 odd years?
Oh, teaching, yeah. Well, the thing that immediately comes to mind was the great tradition of the Viva Voces that we used to take place in the back room of the museum there. And Cambitaglu, Dick Green, myself, Jean-Paul, and Vincent McGaw. Was Vincent here when Jean-Paul was here? Certainly Vincent was there, and we sat round the table and the students were brought in one by one, quaking as to what they might be shown, and then we would put special objects on the table and they had to talk about them. So they had to go in and have a good look at this and know what was there. But they were tremendous fun for us. I don't know, I think
not from the other end. No, not from the other end.
I think the students were a little bit worried by them.
It wasn't just the Nicholson Museum, of course. You were also actively involved with the Macleay Museum for a whole set of different reasons. And this wonderful photograph, I think the clothes give away the date of the photograph. But I just want to quickly point out, amongst the many publications you were involved in, of course, from 1979 is the Macleay Museum publication, 10,000 Years of Sydney Life.
That was great.
Which is an absolutely wonderful publication, and I think it's perhaps time that we do for Chow Chak Wing Museum the 21st century version of it as well. But one of the exciting things was the academics working with the museum in terms of engaging with the broader public. Any memories of that type of experience?
Well, mainly it was, the whole point about teaching archaeology is that you've got to handle the stuff, so that a lot of my teaching would have been done downstairs in the collection that wasn't on show. There's so much you can do with walking around and looking, but it's not really getting into it. So in that sense, but the Macleay, you see, we did manage to do a bit more there. And I know that we've got someone here from the Macleay who was part of my own special interest in another area of teaching, because I loved doing adult education teaching. My belief has always been that archaeology is a community activity that, it should be as much for the people who produce the things as for us who study them. And so I loved involving adults, same as I went on into all the heritage movement, to help set up the legislation and the practical guidelines and all the organization that was necessary so that everybody, the community, could be a part of this discovery process. And for me, again, archaeology was the discovery process as much as anything else. So it was lovely to see Lydia here from the Macleay Museum, because she was part of my adult education teaching, as were many, many of the helpers who came on to both this museum and so on. And also people who went on the various Near Eastern expeditions. A lot of them had done adult education teaching, learning. So that was part of it.
Now, we have run out of time. There was so much more I was hoping we would discuss. Your involvement with ASHA,
We haven't hardly
advocacy, the borough charter, your advocacy in terms of heritage management from everyone from Gough down.
Yeah.
I guess what I'd like to finish up on, in terms of looking back on your career, what are you most proud of? What do you regard as your greatest achievement?
It's so many to think
can
about
boast.
that aren't necessarily great, I have to say. But as I say, I was interested in this whole community concern, so that the work I did with heritage legislation, with Gough and David Yenkin down in Canberra, and then we had this thing called the Project Coordinating Committee, which was writing up the borough charter. And there is no question, absolutely no question, that if I hadn't been on that committee, there would be no archaeological protection of heritage sites. I was the only person there who stood up for them. So in one sense, it is that whole approach to the teaching and the practice and the background to HA that allows total involvement in it in so many ways that I would think of, as more significant than the odd paper on the development of the fibula in Cyprus. I was looking at that the other day. So, from little things, big things grow. And so out of the fibula came really quite a big movement. And I was a minuscule part of it, although I have to say I did say hello to Gough Whitlam. There it was. It did grow, and now it's worldwide. Well, it was then, except for here.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll invite you to join us in thanking Judy, not just for a lovely trip down memory lane this evening, but for everything you've done in the development of archaeological teaching in this country. So thank you very much, Judy.
And can I just say in return, thanks so much to everyone who helped, to our students, to our tutors, to the enormous number of people who contributed to this. It was wonderful. And to the museums. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is food and wine as well. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.